Hello again. So I've got a story for you today. It's quite a long story. We're getting into psychology now, psychology and family history. So this one is called Personality Problems and Poisonous Families. Hubby is evidently unaware of my internal roilings. He goes about the business of stoking the fire, bringing me a cup of water, arranging his lyric sheets, showing no more than a vague, uncomprehending surprise that I'm responding only with the faintest of acknowledgements, grim-faced, tight-lipped, unable to snap back into normal discourse. By nature, he floats through life thinking happy thoughts. Everything is a pleasure to him, me too, usually. I would just so love to be like him, but I can't. I come from a long line of moaners and resenters. I feel like if only I could express this to him, he would understand and we would be friends again. But there is no way of conveying this particular internal blockage. He has no experience of it and he would be unable to relate. He would only say, "Oh, if I was in that position, I would just let it go." The reason I know about moaners and resenters among my ancestors is that my mother used to talk about it in her old age. She would sit on the worn, shiny sofa in her sheltered flat, with nothing much else to do, and brood over her memories. Then she would tell them to me when I visited her. We were all caught up in this sticky web of sulkiness, me, my mother, and her mother's father. Quite possibly it went back beyond that generation, but there are no records. It's also possible that it began with my great-grandfather and his life circumstances. His name was John Roe, and he married Gertrude Robinson in 1879 when he was 28 and she was just 17. They lived in Sheffield. He was a brewer's drayman by trade. I imagine him sitting on his dray, clicking to his horse, with a pipe hanging out of the corner of his mouth all day. It was a family saying that his daughter Mary was the only one who could manage him, and she was the one they called upon to get round him when he was being difficult. You had to have a job and earn a living in those days. It was literally a matter of life and death. If you didn't manage that, there was no safety net, only a miserable end in the workhouse. It made no difference if you had a difficult personality and couldn't get on with people. There was nothing for it but to cope as best you could with whatever life threw at you. Whoops, I've lost my page. Driving barrels around all day sounds like a nice, safe way to earn a living without having to use people skills. The brewer tells you where to deliver and you deliver. "All right, John. Not so bad, thanks, Fred. See you next week, then." "Aye." Great-grandmother Gertrude used to say, "You're born to suffer, and suffer you must." Her husband John certainly had more than his fair share of suffering. He was only 53 when he got cancer of the tongue, and obviously there was no treatment for it at that time. He must have been in absolute agony. When he couldn't eat any more, the family resorted to dripping raw egg into his mouth. Yet all he wanted was for the suffering to end. He tried to hang himself in his bedroom, but the family discovered him in time and cut him down. It's hard to imagine nowadays, in our pampered welfare state, how important it was to keep up a front of respectability. They lived haunted by the terrors of being socially disgraced. Whether it was being out of work, having a child out of wedlock, or having a relative commit suicide, it didn't matter. Those things put you beyond the pale and had to be avoided at all costs. Could it be possible that Gertrude was the difficult one rather than John? Maybe his moods were a response to her selfishness and manipulation. I have no idea what she was like, really. But her leitmotif about being born to suffer could be interpreted as a narcissistic effort to get people to feel sorry for her. She presided over regular family gatherings where the main sport was to discuss the scandals in the news of the world. She weighed 20 stone and spent the later years of her life as an invalid, stuck at home, unable to climb the stairs except on her hands and knees, and keeping her youngest daughter at home to look after her. John and Gertrude had 7 children, and my grandma Mary was the 4th. All the women learned to use a needle as early as possible, because if you had tailoring skills, you would never be out of work. They sat at home sewing away until they got married and left. After Mary married Stephen Partridge, She still used to go home on Sunday afternoons for a good old natter. Her daughter, my mother Joan, got dragged along too, but she had to sit still and keep quiet while the adults deconstructed the world and its goings-on. A little child is just a thirsty sponge, longing to learn how to fit in. How could she not take on board their habits of sneering at and criticising everything? Grandma Mary was a difficult character in many ways. She went to Southampton to do a training course in running evening classes. She was going to teach needlework possibly, but she never actually went on to do it. Putting down your nearest and dearest is usually a sign of low self-confidence, I think. It makes you feel more competent if you can make everybody else look less competent. Grandpa Stephen made some attempts to go into business, but Mary did not support him. His idea of establishing a tailoring business with her and one of her sisters was met with derision. "You know how bad you are with money," they told him, and maybe he was. It seems he was always giving money to people to support their projects and not getting anything in return. A very Christian virtue, but not one to be encouraged when money was so hard to come by. His efforts at property development were a disaster too. He bought a house in Upperthorpe that had 2 cottages to rent at the bottom of the garden. But instead of being a cash cow, it turned out to be a money pit. The tenants complained of damp, so he had to have a drainage ditch dug. They still complained of damp. Eventually, the cottages were condemned by the council, and he was obliged to demolish them at his own expense. I can just imagine how Grandma Mary criticised him for this, filled with helpless resentment at his ineptitude. She probably blamed him for it forevermore. And the irony is that some subsequent owner of that house and garden probably made the profit that had eluded him when land for housing became more sought after. It comforts me a little to know that these habits were passed on to me, as they were passed on to my mother as a child. You know how sometimes you have nothing more pressing to do, so you reflect on things you said and did and cringe with embarrassment at how crass you were and wish you could unsay it all, but you can't? Well, if you know that your mother and your mother's mother before her and your mother's mother's mother before her were all in the habit of talking that way, it puts the thing in a new perspective. You can see the habit of blame as something that was imposed on you. It no longer appears to be inexplicably your fault, and you can try to expunge the oppressive guilt of being that way. So great-grandmother Gertrude sneered and criticised, and great-grandfather John was resentful and sulky. And somehow these 2 unattractive traits got combined in Grandma Mary and passed on to her daughter Joan, and then to me. Mary was 31 when she had Joan. I gathered that she might have had numerous miscarriages. It was unusual to have only 1 child at that time, and probably would not have been by choice. Unfortunately, it meant that all Mary's poisonous ways were concentrated on her 1 child. She would be manipulative. She would wait until Joan came home from school for lunch and then complain about having a headache and make her go to the shop to buy lunch. So Joan would spend her entire lunch break walking around and not get a chance to actually eat. Mary would have moods of resentment which lasted for weeks, during which she would not speak to her own daughter. Little Joan had no recourse against that sort of behaviour in the adult that was supposed to be caring for her. But once, she told me, during one of these episodes, Sunday came around and they were at the family's, so young Joan took a deep breath and piped up about how her mother was refusing to speak to her. This was interesting because it brought together 2 attitudes which were normally kept different, in different watertight mental compartments. You could be as resentful as you liked towards your nearest and dearest, but you had to keep up a front in public. You had to present yourself as participative and chatty, and Mary could not lose face with her relatives. So, of course, she had to switch moods and laugh it off somehow. I can imagine her. "Ah, don't be silly, Joan. We all love each other, don't we?" Sorry about my Yorkshire accent. She would have belittled Joan in the process, but at least she would have been forced to break silence and speak to her again. Joan was like this at home with us, her own children. She would go into moods of huge resentment and keep them up for hours. Not days or weeks, but enough to pass on the habit to me at least. And I observed her one day making the switch. She was being sulky with me, and a neighbour showed up on the doorstep. Instantly she was back to her public mode, all smiles and chattiness. So I learned at an early age that we have two faces, the private one and the public one. The fact that it's possible to switch between them so easily, given the right trigger, suggests that I should be able to flip out of my resentment against hubby and act normally with him again. He would never know anything was amiss. And it would be so much more congenial. But I can't do it. I have such an urge to be grim and sulky until he finally notices and apologises profusely for having so sorely wounded me. Yet at the same time I know this is ridiculous. How ridiculous it is I will allow you to judge for yourself. What happened was that I was about to put another log into the wood stove, and I picked up the nearest one, which happened to be twice the size of most of the logs. It had been there for a day or two and had reached the front of the queue. As I was about to convey it into the stove, hubby piped up saying, "Oh, I was going to save that one for another day. It'll take 3 hours to burn through." The resentment this triggered in me was powerful. It felt as though he was trying to manipulate and control me. It felt as though he had put that log right next to the stove on purpose so that he could then tell me that I was interfering with his mysterious plan. It felt as though he judged me incapable of knowing how long a log takes to burn, without him instructing me on the matter, or of choosing the right log to put in. It felt belittling, in just the same way as I had been belittled by my mother as a child. And yet, from his point of view, what he said was completely innocuous, and I know it. I unbend sufficiently to practice some tunes with him, but I will not sing. Singing feels like something you can only do in the absence of oppression. It's a kind of bearing of the soul which demands a level of self-confidence that I do not currently feel. So finally, I explain all this to him, and he apologises, and as I had expected, he doesn't understand my problem with his comment. He tells me that if I had said such a thing to him, he would have simply responded, "Oh, okay," and chosen another log. He would not perceive it as I did, as someone trying to control him. Then he adds that perhaps it's because he's a man and he's always been used to being in control. And maybe that's what has been the problem with the generations of women in my family. We never had the confidence in ourselves that comes from feeling you're in control.